Thank you all for coming out to the panel on the IP transition. I'm Chris Lewis. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at Public Knowledge, and we want to welcome you all and welcome our panelists. Just to set the stage, this was a panel we actually had hoped to hold in January, and because of all the snow and inclement weather, it did not happen. And so we're glad to be able to come back and have it here in the Ken building. We want to thank Representative Eshu's office for helping us get the space and the coffee and everything. And so please feel free to help yourself to coffee, water, whatever you need. What we hope to do today is have a good conversation around what has been a focus of public knowledge in talking about the IP transition, and that's a values-based discussion around the transition. Our previously scheduled panel was actually before the FCC came down with a path and a direction to move on the transition. Now that we have that, we can certainly reflect upon what they've done and the decisions that they made at the end of January, where they initiated a process to build trials around the transition and to begin a process of managing it. I think it's also noteworthy that that the commissioners also made a commitment to a set of principles that they felt were important in managing and watching and protecting consumers and protecting all of Americans during the transition. So we'll be talking about those as well. But let me introduce our panelists. And again, we really appreciate all four of you being here and adjusting your schedules with the change in scheduling. First, we have immediately to my left, and you have Chris Baker. Chris Baker is the Strategic Policy Advisor from the AARP, and he is with the AARP's Public Policy Institute. He works on a variety of policy areas, including telecommunications, energy, information technology industries, and previously been a Hill staffer working for Senator Paul Sarbanes on energy and telecommunications. So welcome, Chris. Next to him is Ms. Olivia Wein. Olivia is a staff attorney with the National Consumers Law Center, and she is a member of the Federal Communications Commission Consumer Advisory Committee, and really an expert on many telecom issues, but especially dealing with low-income and the Lifeline program, and a strong advocate there. Next to her, we have Cheryl Leanza. Cheryl is the president of her own consulting firm, A Learned Hand LLC, and in that at that firm and in that role, she advises many groups on telecommunications issues, including the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, where she co-chairs a task force on telecommunications. She is also known for her work with the United Church of Christ and their work in telecommunications. And of course, she is a former FCC staffer and deputy director of the Media Access Project in the public interest world. And last on the end here, but not least, is our friend Berin Szoka from TechFreedom. Berin is the president of TechFreedom and has a long career working as an attorney as well as a policy expert and analyst in telecommunications, both at TechFreedom and at the Products and Freedom Foundation. And we're excited to have you all here. And we hope to make this more conversational. And so I'll lead off with some questions to talk about the transition and get perspectives from all of our panelists. But as we move along, we would like to open it up to folks here, and we have plenty of folks who follow this issue closely. Perhaps we have some Hill staffers here who are trying to learn more about it. So please think of questions. Feel free to, when we get to the portion where we will open it up to audience questions, we'll just raise your hand and have folks identify themselves and contribute to the conversation. And lastly, I think the last housekeeping thing is if you have your packet that you received where you checked in, we also have Twitter handles for everyone on there. We always love Twitter at PKN, so we certainly encourage you to use those handles and promote the discussion. So with that, I will get to the discussion. And I talked briefly, folks, about the FCC decision in January. I think that's a real benchmark point in the discussion around the IP transition. But for the last year and a half, we've really seen a lot of intense conversation around the transition from the carriers, certainly from us in the public interest community. We've seen examples out in the field, out in the states, of folks talking about the IP transition. And for those who are new to it, I would define it as, think of it as a transition in technology for their phone network. So we have traditional TDM-based phone networks that ride over what we're used to as our old copper phone networks. You see that phone on the wall, everyone in the back, everyone's used to that phone on the wall that connects to a copper line. But with broadband networks, those phones are transitioning rapidly to an all IP technology technology network. And that means a lot of great, wonderful things and new capabilities and new services. But it is a transition that to this point has been consumer-driven, market-driven, and voluntary, as consumers have made choices that they wanted to upgrade to an IP phone, a VoIP phone, or IP-based communications. And so with this transition, we've heard from the carriers that they want to transition to where they no longer have to maintain the old copper-based TDM networks, not maintain two networks. Certainly that is expensive. And so this transition is about how do we do that in a way that serves everyone, and how do we do that in the best way that serves the nation. And so the FCC did come down with a beginning proceeding in January. And at that proceeding, they voted 5-0 to approve 4 basic principles to transition that are not unlike the 5 principles of public knowledge that put out previously in confinement and packaging. So we'll just start by asking the panel, what are your thoughts on the 4 principles that the FCC marked as important, and how are those principles significant to consumers and folks outside the Beltway, where it really touches their lives? And why don't we start right here with Chris? If that's okay.
That's great. Thanks. I think those are the 4 principles, or public knowledge is 5. Service to all American, interconnected competition, consumer protection, network reliability, and public safety are a good summary of basic protections that we want for services that are so important to us. I mean, there was a survey out just last month that said Americans love connectivity more than food or sleep, almost as much as sex. It's so important, and yet at the same time, this industry is at the bottom of every customer satisfaction index. The American Customer Satisfaction Index ranks 43 industries, and at the very bottom, internet service providers, which is right next to cable TV providers, which is just one below wireless service providers out of 42. So there's sort of a disconnect there, and these basic protections, we're not, I don't think they're asking too much, are important to make sure that we have this basic ability to communicate.
I'd like to build on that, these are not new values, principles that the FCC just cooked up. I mean, these are in the Telecommunications Act. These were sort of embedded in how the communications network has evolved to the communications network we have now. This concept of a ubiquitous communications network was very important to the country. I mean, can you imagine a phone service where you can't pick up the phone and reach only folks in a small cluster, and that network doesn't connect with the next town over? So ubiquity was very important. Affordability was important. Affordability is a barrier for a lot of folks to be able to participate and engage in modern communications. So, these concepts of reliance on this phone network for other industries, and certainly for health and safety, right? If you think about the elementary schools and the little red lever that connects to the fire department, you really rely on that. You don't think about it until maybe, God forbid, you really need it, but you firmly expect that to work. So all of these concepts, this is, as Chris indicated, a very vital infrastructure for the nation's economy, but also for individual consumers, and how we have, how we engage in the marketplace, how we learn, how we engage with healthcare now. It's all becoming even more and more reliant upon a very advanced and solid communications network. So, again, to reiterate, I think the core principles here are right on target. I mean, we've had this communications network in this country. It's been top-notch for a while, and it got there because of these core principles and policies that drive, into alignment with those principles. And so I think it's very important, and it's a good sign that the FCC has reiterated and embraced and reminded us sort of where we came from and how we need to proceed forward with what values.
As Chris said, I'm Cheryl Leanza, and I wanted to make sure that I was clear that today I'm speaking on behalf of the United Church of Christ, which has a media, justice, and communications rights ministry. It's 50 years old. And one of the reasons that the UCC has been involved in this set of issues is because of its importance for civil rights. A lot of the work that the UCC has done in this arena has been specifically in conjunction with my colleagues at other civil rights organizations. So the Leadership Conference is a coalition. So I have copies of our comments that we had filed last year in the IP transition. And so that you can see who signs on to that. But right now, when I'm speaking to the panel, I just wanted to be sure that I'm speaking for my client, the UCC. And so to answer Chris's question about values, so as I said, for us, for the UCC, values, we start with sort of civil rights values. And that's a society where we want your intelligence, your willingness to work, your ingenuity to dictate your success, not your background, not your ethnicity, not your income, right? So that's what we're looking for. It's a society where your own traits and your own strength and your ability to carry on dictates your success. Today, your success in society is largely dependent on your use of technology, as Chris and Olivia were referring to, access to healthcare, access to education, access to a job. How are you gonna, get to a job? And lots of people have known the statistics about how many jobs you have to apply for online. Even if the job itself doesn't require online skills, you can't get the job because you're online. So technology is really important as we strive for these universal goals of equity and achievement and success. Opportunity to improve a situation where in so far race and income and education really have dictated your use of technology to some extent. I mean, one of my favorite statistics is that and this is the 2010 data that the Department of Commerce put out, but they found that at that time there was an 11% gap between whites and Hispanics and whites and African Americans, even when you controlled for factors such as income, geography, in broadband adoption. So still we have broadband adoption, we have technology use really being very different depending on where you're coming from, who you are in life, and that dictates your abilities to succeed. So we see that the IP transition could be this opportunity. Maybe it could be the ability to do something better. Lots of consumers have chosen new technologies, and I sort of like to think about it. I'm not a technologist, I'll be the first to tell you. I sort of like to think about the IP transition as like when you get a new operating system on your computer. Like there are some things that are great. You're like, wow, I can do this, and this is so much better, and they fixed that. And there are other things you're like, oh boy, that's not working for me. So it's it is a step forward. The people who created it intended it to be a step forward. It is in a lot of ways, but there are other things that maybe don't work for you, and it really depends on who you are and how you were using it. So for that reason, when my civil rights colleagues and I got together and tried to think about what was important, we did come down with some similar set of values, but wanted you to think about sort of why are we looking at those values, why are those so important? So when we filed our comments, we talked about universal service, public safety, network reliability, and consumer protection. Those are the four that we thought about. But I think it's most important.
It might be helpful just to take a step back and make sure we're all clear on what we're talking about. So there's a tendency in Washington to talk about to capitalize nouns and to talk about something that's, IP transition is this big looming thing that we have to make some sort of conscious technocratic policy decision about. And in that respect, it's sort of like Y2K or the DTV transition. You may remember getting those annoying converter boxes, or maybe you don't because maybe you didn't really care about getting broadcast. But so the first point I would make is that this isn't some looming thing that's about to happen in the future. This is something that most Americans have already done. Roughly, it's a little hard to measure for a variety of reasons, but over half of Americans have already given up on the traditional telephony network. You've heard the term TDM. Basically, it just means that it's a circuit switch network. It's an old way, pre-internet way of running a communications network. About 40 to 50% of Americans have already switched to using their cell phone either completely or essentially, while they may have a landline, relying on their cell phone for all their calls. But other Americans have already switched to running what is essentially an IP network from their cable provider. They get their telephone service from them. So we're not talking about a world in which someone's going to flip the switch and all of a sudden every American's home communications network is going to change. We're talking about a dwindling number of people who are still using traditional telephony. And the issue is, and that's not to say it doesn't raise important questions, but the issue is that AT&T and traditional telephone carriers are spending more and more money to try to maintain a network that is decades or even approaching a century old, full of copper hardware, and most importantly, switches that are very difficult to maintain. And they're trying to do that with a shrinking cost base. So there's a presumption in many of these conversations that the way that things used to work was just fine, and we should just figure out how to adapt that old way of doing things to new technology. But it doesn't really work for the simple reason that the old system, the technology went hand in hand with the marketplace design. So you essentially had a monopoly provider building out a gold-plated, extremely expensive copper network that worked pretty well for what it did. It was quite reliable because Americans paid through the nose in their telephone bills for that reliability. They paid through the nose to build out that network to areas where cost of service would otherwise have been very high. So the question today is, we have developed these expectations about network reliability and public safety and service to everybody. The question is, how do you transition those to a world where not just the technology is changing, but the basic structure of the market has changed? You now have multiple competing providers. So you'll have your traditional telephone company who has the copper network and wants to switch that to IP. You have cable providers who are providing an equivalent service. You have fiber providers that are coming online in certain areas, and of course you have wireless providers. So the question that I would just suggest today is, this is already here. The FCC is very far behind at this point. All the FCC has done thus far is to start trials. And that's a good thing. There are a lot of questions that we don't necessarily have answers to about comparative reliability, for example, and how best to achieve it. But I will just point out, in closing for my opening remarks, that the FCC's order, when you read it, the very first thing the FCC says is, we must act with dispatch. Well, it took them about 14 months just to approve trials. So I would just start by suggesting that whatever the ideal system we come up with here is, or might be, that the clock is ticking, the FCC moves very slowly, and what's at stake here is really quite large. It's billions and billions of dollars that are being spent every year to maintain an outdated network that fewer and fewer people are using, that in turn is causing rates to rise for the consumers who are left trying to bear the cost of that network. So I think this is where I certainly adamantly agree with public knowledge. The sooner we allow companies to make that transition, the better. And so the question I think today really is, what do we do with the data we get out of these trials? The FCC is supposed to come back, I think they said in May, with data. We'll see. I fear this is going to drag out for quite a lot longer than it needs to. And part of the reason for that is that there are a lot of people who are trying to jump into this conversation who don't really care about the values at stake, as everyone here does, but are really trying to protect their own business models. There are certain companies out there today whose entire business model depends on the outdated system that we had in the copper network. And they have every incentive to slow down this transition as much as they can and to load it up as a sort of Christmas tree to protect themselves. And I don't think that's something that anybody here really wants to see happen.
So Berin is certainly taking us to the topic of the trials, and that's what I wanted to focus in on next. And certainly public knowledge, and he acknowledged we have supported the idea of trials. We think it's a good thing. And that while we acknowledge that the transition is happening, and that's a good thing, that the trials serve an important role, we believe, in ensuring that however the transition happens, that those folks that have not made it yet are protected. Chris, maybe we can start with you. With the trials that the FCC has set in motion, and Berin, talk about the timeline. They're already taking proposals from carriers. We've seen some come out from AT&T in Florida. How do you think we as consumers, we as Americans should view those trials? What do we need to learn from them? How does that part of the process, the trial part of the process, serve everyone?
Well, first, I think the FCC in May will approve the trials. I think that's what happens. And I would agree that this process, which, as Berin said, is happening. It's going. People are moving, although at a slow pace. Although I would argue that it may not be the FCC that's moving slowly. It may be the carriers that are moving slowly to do this. The broadband in the United States is slower. The statistics, and it's important that as part of these trials to make sure that functionality stays, that reliability, that the services that you use on the network are available as the transition continues. And it's important that we have the data, as the FCC says, an open deliberative process to identify the challenges by making data-driven decisions about these technology transitions. And our concern, I think, is the AT&T's proposal is very heavily redacted. Even the consumer timeline, their proposal for this process is completely blacked out. You have to file something that's basically filling out a mortgage to get confidentiality rights to look at this information. So I think the number one thing that could come out of this is that we have better data of what this transition is. Do people have the capability to make calls? Does it work when the power goes out? And we need to know that. And what happens to areas that are harder to serve? Do people just get left behind? So data and an open process, I think, is what really needs to come out of this process.
I'm Olivia Wein with the National Consumer Law Center. Our focus is on low-income consumers. So from that lens, really what we're looking at with these trials is, will the consumers react? Will they understand what will be different? Will they be able to afford it? How will that affordability value be protected? It's one thing if it's like a teaser rate, and then teaser rates go away. What's to keep that from happening? The quality. Is it, if it's a new technology, it may not work the same in a storm or in an emergency. How are consumers going to respond to that? How do they indicate that they don't like it or they do like it? Their ability to collect feedback is really important. I think third-party access to that will be very important coming out in ensuring the data is good. I think while the technology has been evolving, there are still things that consumers are relying on the copper for. For example, going back to like the elementary school and the alarm, service. Some of these things, I don't know where they are in the transition, if they're there yet, but certainly, there are things that shouldn't be tested on real people, like public safety. Those should sort of be tested, you know, with certain backup structures in place, existing structures at least. I think it's really important for customers to have choice. And if the promise is that we're moving to something the same or better, something comparable or better, we really need to be able to understand what that is. And the consumer education piece, America is a very diverse country. There are different levels of literacy and understanding. I mean, I think we do run the risk of people being incredibly frustrated if we're not very careful and thoughtful. So with all due respect, I mean, I understand that there are folks that just really want to rush into it. I do think that we really do need to be careful and shape these trials properly and make sure that you know, what the consumers are being offered truly is comparable or better. And that we've built in mechanisms to gauge their pulse and how these products are performing. We have questions about like this concept of moving to, you know, from landline to wireless. I mean, it's that comparability question, the reliability question. Will you be able to make that phone call in an emergency if you're upstairs in a corner bedroom? Will that work? Will weather affect how this product works? I mean, all of these things are important questions. So again, it's a very important network. It's important to design these trials right. So I understand the push for speed, but a trial that goes out the door that's sort of half-baked will not really give us the information we need to make sound policy decisions moving forward.
And I want to come back to the reliability point later on, but Cheryl?
Right, sure. So I think in terms of the trials, I actually think that one point that Berin made is really worth repeating, which is that there are a lot of folks who have already transitioned. And in fact, in the debate over trials and whether they should be authorized or not, I feel like one of the things that has been missing is what's happened so far in the real world where people have transitioned. We don't have any data on that, and it doesn't look like there's much proposal. I mean, there's some effort, I think, the FCC has happened so far to the people who have transitioned. One of the other points that Berin made was that there's, 50% of the U.S. has not transitioned. I don't know if I would call 50% of the United States dwindling, but there are people who have transitioned, but there are many people who have not transitioned. So the people who have transitioned so far have made a choice in the marketplace. The other thing I'd like to focus on with regard to people who have transitioned already is that although it's certainly voluntary, I mean, nobody put a gun to their head and said you must buy this mobile phone, there are reasons why your background, income, and education level are dictating your choices. So one of the other helpful pieces of data, Pew just did another study that came out with 2013 data about the gap between who has broadband at home and who has a smartphone at home. And you will see huge gaps, 40-point gaps. If you're white and non-Hispanic, it's 74% likely that you have broadband at home. If you have no high school education, it's 37%. There's a huge gap between where people are. A lot of folks who don't have broadband at home have a smartphone. Well, a smartphone is a very high value proposition. You can get some internet access, you can get your phone service, so you can get multiple different needs met with this one product, with this one price. So if you're a low income person, you may have sort of been forced into, by your circumstances, to choose that your internet connection is this mobile product. Now, in a lot of ways, that's great, right? Thank goodness we have something that's mobile, that's cost effective, that somebody can get even if they're really struggling in their own economic circumstances. On the other hand, these are the folks who really need to use the internet to pull themselves up. It's really hard to apply for a job on a mobile phone. It's really hard to get an education on a mobile phone. So we're looking at this disparate impact of people out there in the real world so far, which we're struggling to understand, which we first started to understand when the National Broadband Plan got started. But I think the follow-up to the National Broadband Plan, understanding how the IV transition is affecting people out in the world now. And then, just reiterating what Chris and Olivia said, I think on the trials, I think we want transition, we want to have some safeguards. The one thing I'll notice about the trials is there's been a big conversation about what's going to be voluntary, once again, this voluntary question. And I think the FCC has said that no carrier has to involuntarily transition, but it's very unclear whether consumers, I think consumers are going to have to wind up transitioning. If a carrier picks that you're in a transition, I think it's highly likely that they're going to wind up having to switch, and it's not clear to me, and maybe others have more detail on how that will play out. But it's challenging for somebody who has to switch as opposed to somebody who has chosen to switch. So those are the things that we'll be looking at.
Before you go, Berin, Cheryl, we were actually, Olivia and I were discussing this before the panel started, and they were clear in the proposal that consumers who are already being served can opt out of the trials.
Oh, that's good. That's good news. I was looking at some other points. So that's good news that at least the consumers will. So that's a good point. Thanks.
Yeah, but we should be clear here, and I think part of my role in this panel is to say the things that are hard to say. This is not going to be optional. In other words, the copper-based network, as it has been run, is going to disappear, right? That's not a choice. Nobody gets to say, I want to keep this archaic technology, because they're not willing to bear the cost of it. So, let's suppose that there's 5% of Americans who, for whatever reason, just adamantly insist that they don't want to give up the traditional TDM network. At the end of the day, the answer is going to be, and it really has to be, sorry, but that network is just not going to be maintained because the cost of maintaining it for a small number of people would be astronomical. So, while and this is precisely why this conversation about values is so important, because notwithstanding what I said earlier about the dangers of sort of top-down decision-making, this really is a situation where we're talking about an outdated technology that has a definite, well, it's not definite yet, but it is going to be retired at some point. Public knowledge acknowledges this. The question is how you manage that transition, how you do it safely. And so the problem is the FCC faces three challenges. Number one, this is a really hard area. There are a lot of moving pieces that nobody in this room has all the answers to. And so I commend them for gathering more data. That's what they have to do. The second problem is they're a bureaucracy that moves very slowly. So my point is, it took them 14 months just to ask the questions to say, please propose trials. Right? That doesn't bode well for how long this process is going to take overall. So I'm not saying that the actual studies or the transition should be rushed. What I'm saying is there should be no unnecessary delay, and that delay is frankly not encouraging. And my point about the politics of this is that there are a lot of companies here who have an incentive, we can talk about this later in the discussion of competition, who have a very strong incentive to delay this, because every month that they delay the transition is money that they don't have to spend on themselves upgrading their own infrastructure to connect to a new IP network. Or frankly, in many cases, these are so-called competitive resellers. They may simply go out of business here. So every month that they can delay this is just money in the bank for them. And then the third point that I just want to reiterate is the FCC is facing a fundamental challenge that is beyond technology, which is the landscape, the competitive landscape and the nature of communications in this country has changed fundamentally from 1996. In 1996, we still had a Communications Act that was written for a pre-internet age that was premised on the idea that you were never really going to have facilities-based competition for providing communications. And we have that today. And the FCC itself has recognized this. The National Broadband Plan was really a masterpiece of recognizing that the communications world is changing, and that whatever else we do, we should be doing whatever we can to encourage the construction of broadband, meaning generally communications networks, and that we could have competition in those, and there's a lot that government should be doing to clear more spectrum, because, for example, the minorities that heavily rely on wireless services, they're the ones that suffer most because there isn't enough spectrum available. And then a lot of local and municipal issues about being able to put up towers to serve customers, especially in cities. Or the chief obstacle for deploying broadband is putting wires under streets and getting pole attachment rates. Those are all real problems that would help significantly with all of this conversation, but these are related topics. And my point generally is the FCC has a very poor track record thus far. They've done very little on the National Broadband Plan, despite having broad bipartisan support for that. And so I think part of our conversation is we all pretty much agree what the values are. So it's A, how do you operationalize them? And B, understanding what the trade-offs are. How do you make sure that this gets done in a way that, yes, deals with the problems that are diagnosed in the trials, but doesn't delay, and it allows the companies that are involved here to stop wasting money on maintaining an old network and to be able to transition that support into broadband. And I'll just give you one concrete example before I close, which is to say, that, people complain about not having more choices beyond cable, and I'm all in favor of making it easier to deploy competing networks. But it's worth keeping in mind that even that copper infrastructure out there that AT&T has, for example, even that can support 45 megabit per second service. And sure, that's not a gigabit service, and some of us, a very small percentage of us, might want a faster network. But 45 megabits per second is a heck of a lot faster than almost all Americans demand today. That's enough to run, say, 9 high-quality Netflix streams in your home. And the point is, that's the kind of thing, we could have another viable competitive network out there for not just AT&T, but other telephone companies. But they're delayed in making those upgrades by having to spend the $14, $15 billion a year that they're wasting today on maintaining the traditional TDM infrastructure. That's the kind of trade-off that I would suggest we keep in mind.
So many things I want to come back to. I want to come back to the marketplace landscape you're talking about there. But first I wanted to ask Olivia, you talked about the red lever in the schools, the alarm systems. When we, if we're trying to figure out where we're going to be when these trials are done, when the transition is done, what do you think the transition looks like at its end? What should it look like if we do it right? Does it include those alarm services? What else does it look like?
Well, I think, if these principles and values are embraced in the transition, then everyone, regardless of geography or income, will have access to an affordable, reliable, ubiquitous, quality network that was comparable or better than what exists now, if this transition lives up to its promise. And there's a lot to unpack within each of those value propositions. The affordability proposition is something that's in the Telecom Act now. Quality services should be available at just and reasonable affordable rates. People shouldn't be priced out of the communications network. The equity issues that Cheryl has been describing, these are very real challenges for this country. No one should be left behind. Affordability is a key to ensuring a connected nation. So we've got to figure out how in the transition we sort of preserve, urban areas maybe in wealthier parts of the country, the choices there could be very different and are very different than, maybe a very remote, geographically challenging rural area. What that service looks like in that harder to serve place is going to be a big question mark, right? And so, how do we do this right? There's room for improvement. There's also great risk. There's great risk that we don't quite get it right, and then we get 2 tiers, 3 tiers of connectivity in this nation. The haves, the has not, and there's so much tied. It's the Internet of Things, right? So we got to get it right. But embracing sort of that affordability piece and the ubiquity piece. There are these concepts, universal service, the universal service programs have a role to play here in investing where the market can't, the market won't make the argument. Berin may or may not agree with me on that one. But I think that it's very important that every part of this country, everyone be connected. We don't want to disinvest in rural America. It's important that we have a very vibrant and strong rural America. That's the quality and the reliability are issues. A service that's of such poor quality or poor reliability is barely service. That's close to non-service. So again, if we get it right, you will be able to communicate in the form of your choice with somebody, anybody in America and overseas.
So Olivia's, honing in on this value of affordability, and when I think about affordability, a lot of times you hear people talk about the way that you get affordability is to have good competition, and certainly one of the principles that we talk about is the importance of having competition and interconnection of some of the smaller carriers to the broader network, and so how does that jive? And I'll open up to anyone, but maybe, I don't know if Berin wants to start with this. How does that jive with the landscape that you're describing of having a competitive marketplace versus older rules that were written in a monopoly era? Because I know from our perspective at Public Knowledge, we always have described that there's been a lack of opportunity for broadband, that you really have a choice, most consumers have a choice of one or two.
That's mainly a function of municipal and state restrictions on deploying broadband, which I'm all in favor of dealing with. But let me just suggest that there are really three different issues here that get lumped together in this this point about prices. This is really what we're talking about: prices, competition, and interconnection. So the first issue is really how much competition can we have? Second issue is how do you deal with costs? And the third issue is about interconnection on the back end between networks. So the reality that nobody really wants to talk about here is that the cost of deploying service varies significantly. If you live in an urban area, it's fairly inexpensive to roll out service to you in terms of building the network. Whether people can afford it is another question. It's a demand side question. But on the supply side, the costs are fairly low. If you live in a rural area where there's a very low density and you have very few customers to serve, the costs are going to be high. And the reality is that Americans have never had to face that. Americans have no idea how much it costs to build out networks to rural and low density areas. And so the problem that we're facing right now is in the traditional monopoly system, you papered that over. You essentially forced consumers in dense areas where the costs of service were low to subsidize consumers in the rest of the country, right? And that may or may not have been a good idea, but that worked because we had a monopoly system. So the reality today is that we're dealing with a competitive landscape where as soon as you have more than one, it doesn't have to be competitive enough, but as soon as you have more than one company providing service, that framework breaks down. You can no longer expect implicit cross-subsidies to work because for the obvious reason that one company can simply can serve the low-cost service areas and not the high-cost service areas, or vice versa. So the question is, before you get to how much competition do you want, what can you do to facilitate it, the question is, what is the smart way to subsidize? If we're going to subsidize service to some people, what's the smart way to do it? And the really short answer is, doing it through that sort of implicit program is incompatible with competition. In other words, you can't do it when you have competition, and it also hurts competition because, for example, you end up mandating that a new entrant has to build out to the entire market or has to serve everybody, right? That maybe protects incumbents. That's not good for consumers. So what you really want is take the brakes off, let anybody deploy, make it as easy as possible to build a competitive network. And if you're going to subsidize people because you decide that the cost of service in some areas are too high or purchasing power is too low, you should focus on those two problems. So how do you do that? Well, ideally you do it from general tax revenues. That's not how we do it in this country. We do it instead from universal service, which is legally, technically is not a tax, but in fact really is one. So we can have a conversation about how to have to do is bifurcate that. We can't paper over the problem anymore and expect the taxes to be done inside the networks. So that's the sort of short answer. We can figure out how to do that. But on competition, the answer, as I said before, is we really can have facilities-based competition. It wasn't envisaged in the '96 Act, but it's already happened. It's happened with the traditional telephone companies competing with wireless companies, competing with cable companies, and now there are starting to be other fiber options deploying. It's worth pointing out that Google Fiber, for example, which is deployed in several cities, has chosen not to offer a voice service because the FCC and its regulations have made this so difficult. So companies like Google, which were for a time were pushing FCC regulation in certain areas, have realized how problematic that can be, and that has been a significant deterrent to real competition. But then the final issue that gets rolled into this, which is sometimes called competition, is this confusion about interconnection, right? So the real issue, the legitimate problem that we have to think about how to deal with is when you have multiple providers out there, and especially if you have small providers that are serving rural areas, how do you regulate or expect the market to work? As when I call my grandma and she lives in a rural area, does my provider, which let's say it's a cable company or a fiber company, does that interconnect with her provider? And the short answer is the FCC, despite all the concern about this transition, the FCC can continue to regulate that market by virtue of regulating access to the numbering system. There is, of course, also the antitrust laws, which deal with competitive foreclosure. I'm not particularly concerned about that market. I think that it's very unlikely that you're going to see any sort of breakdown there. Interconnections work very well on the internet. There's really been no problem there generally. But the reason this gets confused is I kept alluding to smaller providers, so-called competitive resellers earlier. They're really trying to muddy the waters. They play to concerns about that by claiming that they are providing competition. So what they're doing is reselling service that is provided by facilities-based providers today and calling that competition. And these companies, this is what the 96 Act thought of as competition, they don't want to upgrade their networks. They don't want to invest in having to connect and do IP. And so they are trying to either slow the transition or ensure that the facilities-based providers have to pay for the cost of these resellers continuing to operate. And my short answer is, if they want to upgrade their own networks, that's fine. If they want to continue reselling service, that's fine. But that's not real competition. It's a fake, artificial, government-created form of competition that assumed that real competition was impossible. The real competition isn't impossible. We've seen it today. It already happens with broadband networks. And if we really want to promote those, that's what we should be focusing on. We should be picking up where the National Broadband Plan left off in terms of what do you do to get more providers going to the home.
Cheryl, and then I want to come to Chris.
Sure. So I just wanted to kind of respond a little bit to what Berin's saying, and I think Berin took on the entire 1996 Act broadband plan, universal service, and so I will just put a pin that I could probably also speak as long as Berin did on many things that he's just touched on, but I'd like to kind of bring it back to a couple of points I think that are relevant with regard to the IP transition. I think we've got to keep in mind, first of all, economics of networks. Networks are more valuable the more people are connected. This is why we created the concept of universal service, which was actually AT&T's idea way back in the day. So we did not create universal service. There's two reasons to create universal service. One is because economic value increases for all users the more people are connected. The network would not be valuable to Berin if he cannot call his grandmother. Why would he buy something that he can't call people who he wants to talk to? It does not matter where his grandmother lives. He wants to talk to her. The network is more valuable. The network is more valuable to you because you can pick up the phone and call anybody. That's why it's valuable. That is a very strong economic reason why we create universal service. There's a second thing. We have a value structure in this society. We value democracy, as I started out from the beginning. We want everybody to be able to make the best of themselves based on their own abilities. We don't want to have other things like where you live dictate your success in society, whether that be your happiness or your economic success. So we have always balanced our thoughts on this area with two approaches. We use competition where we can. Competition is very valuable. It's great. It unleashes innovation. It decreases costs. It's an awesome, function of capitalism. We like to use competition as much as we can. At the same time, we have a safety net. There is a minimum below which we are not going to let anybody go, and we don't care where you live. We don't care what your background is. We don't care if you speak English. You are going to have a minimum. And we decide to try to combine those both. Now, Berin is right. It's really complicated to combine both, right? We could just have pure straight-up capitalism, and if you lived in rural Iowa, sorry, no phone for you. Sorry, no 911 for you. We don't do that in this country because we have a series of democratic values that we try to entrust. So I just wanted to keep those two things separate. And then the other thing I just wanted to sort of touch on a little bit in response to Berin's point was some of these universal values that we have cost money. 911 costs money. Connecting everybody, even in Rocky Mountains, even in rural parts of the country, costs money. So yeah, there is going to be a cost. It's not going to be we're going to just offload these costs unless we abandon all these values, which everybody seems to have joined onto in terms of ubiquity. So those costs are expensive and they are important. So we are going to the idea that we could just keep maintaining the existing network indefinitely, no matter the cost, I think is probably correct. We can't just keep maintaining it, but at the same time, if we're going to have these values and implement these values, there is going to be a cost to those values, and working out the right way to apportion those costs, I think, is part of the complexity that the FCC is dealing with.
Chris, I wanted to come to you because I know the AARP has done a lot of work in the States We've had some states that have made moves to deregulate telecommunications and communications networks. Others might be considering it, and so with the balance that we've always had between state and federal regulations, how do you see that playing into the transition here? And then if you also want to touch on the competition aspect for carriers, smaller carriers, big carriers, feel free.
And I'd just like to respond real quickly to Olivia's question about the ideal networks. And, this is an IP transition. And one of the interesting things is wireless, to the extent that they're looking to transition, is not IP. That's understandable. I mean, the FCC says, it's called an IP transition, but the FCC says wireline to wireless. But the fact is, it's not considered IP unless you get to LTE, which is. And it does matter. Wireline to wireless isn't necessarily competition if that's not what you need. If you need the reliability, if you want to be able to call Berin's grandmother, it's important. And so we've had a trial. We've already had a trial in Fire Island, New York, after Superstorm Sandy, and they replaced the copper network with wireless. And there was a firestorm response to that because some people had problems with their remote monitoring of a pacemaker. Some people had problems with their alarm systems not working. There's all sorts of things that we need to figure out before we make this transition. They lost their DSL, that's right.
Small businesses couldn't do credit card.
Right, I mean, there's all kinds of things. So, I appreciate the need to get to this transition, to move on and get everybody the benefits, but I think that we need to aspire to something better. And Berin talks about the National Broadband Plan, and that is great. It has goals for 2015, for 2020, for broadband for America. The IP transition order is a little less aspirational. It says no reduction in broadband and no reduction in service quality. We should be trying to do better than that. So I just want to say that.
If I just respond briefly. So Fire Island has gotten a lot of attention. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that there are really two very different modes that this transition can work in. So Fire Island is an outlier where the copper system was destroyed because of a natural disaster. And the question was, if you're starting from scratch, what do you do? And the short answer is it would have been astronomically expensive. Nobody on Fire Island would have been willing to pay to rebuild that network and provide a wireline network to every home. But generally speaking, that's not the situation we're talking about.
Hold on, let me finish.
Let me finish.
Well, you sort of hijacked my...
Let me just
finish your thought.
Generally speaking, what we're talking about is not replacing the entire wireline infrastructure with a wireless network. What we're talking about is having that wireline infrastructure. It's still the same copper that connects to your home. What changes is the hardware between your home and their system becomes one that can carry an IP system and network instead of the current circuit switched one. So in terms of, for example, one important difference about broadband service, in the case of Fire Island, yes, you might lose your DSL, you might have only wireless for broadband, and that might have a much lower usage limit for the course of the month. Whereas generally speaking, what we're talking about is actually making the copper networks that go to your home work much, much faster, such as the 45 megabit per second per service that UVerse is rolling out.
And so what happened in Fire Island was Verizon decided that was not in their best interest to continue with the wireless, and they decided to upgrade the Fire Island with fiber connections, so that it worked out. They got a better connection. But to your question, or you want?
I just want to jump in, but Berin, some of the initial word we heard on these trials was for rural America, there is this notion of pushing them to wireless. And so that's the open question, is it going to be comparable? Is it going to be better? What is it? And we certainly hope it's not the Fire Island product or the Fire Island experience.
Or even worse, in the trial, there's a small percentage where AT&T doesn't know how they're going to serve them. So wireless may not even be available in that instance as well.
Well, then, let me suggest maybe that there really needs to be a sixth value or a fifth value, depending on what list we're looking at here, which is really about cost and affordability. And that doesn't just mean to individuals, although it does mean that in particular, but it means overall, how much is this thing going to cost? And look, the reality is that if a company is proposing to roll out wireless service in an area, either because of a natural disaster or because it's a very rural area, it's ultimately because of cost. And so the question, to be honest about this, is we can't expect that Verizon's going to roll out fiber in every single place where someone raises a fit without there being a large cost to bear there. And in the old monopoly world, if Verizon was the only company in America, we could just say, Verizon, you have to roll out fiber everywhere, and Verizon would eat the cost and would pass it along to other customers. We don't live in that world anymore. So the reality is we can't expect companies to roll out service like that and then themselves pay for it, which really means that other customers pay for it. If we're going to mandate that sort of thing, there's got to be a subsidy program to pay for it. And I mean, we could do that, we could talk about that. We have to figure out how much that costs and whether taxpayers ultimately, the reality is whatever the values here are at stake, we may get to a world where we decide that, for certain people in very remote areas, that wireless service really may be the best option. And the question is how to make it as robust as possible. But you can't have these conversations without talking seriously about the costs.
But
So-
the cost, we do
Sure.
talk seriously about cost, and I think, in Berin's world, we all have 3 providers to pick from, and competition is robust, and they're driving prices down. The reality is that just in terms of, pure antitrust economic analysis, you introduce a new competitor into the market, just one additional competitor doesn't do anything to bring prices down. 3 competitors only maybe hints at it. If you want to talk about just a traditional economic model, you need like 10 competitors to actually really wreak any havoc on reducing prices. So the situation where now we have three mechanisms to offer service in the country, wireless, cable, and telco, many of which are now, banding together and dividing up the market in the country into markets where, they're going to work together and only sell one product, but you can buy it from Comcast or you can buy it from, Verizon. I think I'm having a hard time sort of recognizing the world that Berin's describing where
So,
we have
no,
do not interrupt me, okay? I appreciate you. I'm totally willing to let you talk. I'm just still right in the middle of my conversation. So,
Finish up, Cheryl.
yeah, absolutely.
I want to jump in.
I will. Thank you. We don't have competition. Now, we do have a system to talk about, paying for infrastructure upgrades. That's called the Universal Service System. We all pay into it now through our phone carriers. The FCC's been working ahead to try and revitalize and to upsize and modernize that. So I think that's a really good place to have that debate. And I think the IP transition, as we move through this phase, I think we will definitely be looking at how the IP transition will be implemented and addressed within the Universal Service Framework. But we have a system. There is that system. I don't think that the IP transition, some of the discussion about whether there should be trials, really is impacted very much on whether we have to subsidize certain kinds of service. We do. We know that, and I think that's the next step. But first, we have to see. Technology working? Are people able to transition? Are public safety still working? Are people able to get their education and all the things that they get over this network working well? And then we absolutely do need to address that subsidy system, but we have a subsidy system right now. So the need for subsidies for certain people to continue to get service to maintain our basic democratic values, that's not in question. And I don't think anybody's really raised that question too much, except to the extent that there's some folks who are saying, well, some people are just going to have to give it up. And our basic core common values about what is required service, minimum required service for everybody in the country, we're just going to have to get rid of some of that because it's just too expensive to serve some people. I don't think most people want to be in that place, but I think that subsidies to ensure those core values are implemented are absolutely essential.
So let's pause here for a minute because we have about 10, 15 minutes left, and I do want to give folks a chance to ask questions if they have them. And there's a lot of things that I know we had on our list discussed and we hadn't gotten to. There's a lot of things that have been thrown out that we didn't really get to dive into. The reliability issue got brought up early on. There's this ongoing discussion about it. We didn't get to the states even though I tried to ask you.
You did it. My fault.
There's this question of wireless as a substitute and what we're doing in rural areas. So let's go to questions, but if there aren't a lot of questions, we can come back to some of these topics. I know we have one over here, so tell us who you are.
My name is Devin Ankerson. I'm from MUTC. I just wanted to ask you guys just a quick question based about the trials. My understanding is that there are several phases, and I heard Berin or someone sort of allude to the length of time it's going to take to actually get some information from them. I just want to know from the panelists, what's your sense of how long it's going to take to get actionable data from the trials? And then I don't know if Cheryl wants to chime in about whether or not there's any action on getting data from some of the ongoing work. I think Verizon is already rolling out in certain places. So.
Cheryl, you want to start? Berin, you're certainly concerned about the timeline.
I mean, I mean, for the folks who, I mean, right now the FCC's got these trials are in for comments, so I think we're going to see soon how quickly those trials can get implemented and we can get data. I mean, I think it'll take a little bit of time.
Yeah, a year to.
Does anybody have an estimate?
No,
I don't have an estimate.
it's blacked out. You can't tell on time. I can tell you you hear that it's going to be a while before. And then the question is, who's collecting the data? It doesn't look like there's a third-party reviewer, so this will be AT&T providing the data.
So let me frame it a different way. What should the expectations be with the trials? Because we know, if that's helpful, we know that they're collecting proposals for trials now. We know in May they're going to select them. So as these come in, what do you guys think the expectation should be on the length of time and the quality of the data that we should be getting back? And Berin, why don't you start?
Well, we don't know. I mean, I think it should be done as quickly as it can be, while gathering the data in a way that actually allows the FCC to make sound decisions. But my concern isn't about the length of time the trials themselves take, because contrary to what was said earlier, the carriers are desperate to do this transition. They are spending so much money right now maintaining these networks that they're not delaying. It's the FCC that is dawdled. It took 14 months just to say we're going to have trials. My concern is, so there's two questions. How much time does it take to get the data? Maybe, and then how good is the data? Is it adequate to address concerns here? And I don't want to wind up in a situation where that doesn't produce the data that everyone thinks is necessary, because then we won't be able to make a decision. The whole thing will take longer. So how long does it take to get good data? And then the question that I'm concerned about is, how long does it take the FCC to act on that?
Yeah, that was my question.
Right. Well, that we have no idea. But I'm just saying, if it took them 14 months to figure out how to ask the questions about trials, not even approving proposals, right? That still hasn't happened yet. If it takes them 14 months to do that, how long is it going to take them to actually, authorize the trials come May, and then once the data comes back in, to make a decision?
What's the data come back in?
Right. Well, I know that's okay. I mean, I have a couple of thoughts on data. I think there's two things. One is I will tell you, and I have copies. I don't know if I mentioned this. The leadership conference comments are here. The huge focus of our civil rights comments were on data, and it's because we see. I think Chris said earlier, we see that transition could be an opportunity, but also having been through things like the DPP transition, realize it's not an opportunity. So we would really like to see, can the IP transition increase broadband adoption, particularly in communities that haven't adopted broadband? Will the cost come down, or will functionalities be broken out into various products so that actually, in order to get the same functionality, you have to purchase more products so the prices go up, which could obviously be challenging for people who are struggling economically. Another really important piece of data that we haven't seen yet, and I'm still working on digging into the AT&T proposals, and obviously a lot of them are not available completely publicly yet, is consumer education and consumer, culturally appropriate consumer education. And I think that's a role that I think partners can play. I think there's large numbers of civil rights community who really know how to communicate with their communities, and they're happy to work with carriers to make sure that the information that people have makes sense to them, so that they can make an educated decision. And now they know, how are they supposed to reach 911? Is it going to be different? Or, how is the price going to be? How is their usage going to impact what they pay? So I think those are really important pieces of data. And then we were talking briefly about network reliability, but that's the other one. Small businesses are really important, small entrepreneurs. We want everybody to be able to make success and create jobs. And if, the terrible example on Fire Island is an example where suddenly you can't use credit cards anymore because your network is down somehow, or your network doesn't interface with credit cards, obviously that can be really challenging for a small business. So we wanted to make sure that all that kind of data is being collected, and then data, once it's implemented, consumer protection, those kind of things are really important. So that data, I think, is really important from the civil rights perspective anyway. And then in terms of the FCC, I actually wish the FCC had been a little bit more pushy with the carriers. I was actually really surprised that a year ago, May, when the FCC, AT&T filed this petition, and the FCC pretty quickly saw comment on it, and then there was another item that came out from the FCC. I sort of expected last summer that we were going to see the carriers put forward their proposed trials. Like some of the carriers have really been thinking about it. It's their idea. They want to move. And so I expected the carriers to sort of take the bull by the horns and submit some proposals. And we didn't see those yet, right? We haven't seen them until this whole process has gone forward. And I felt like the FCC really had to push the carriers to even submit trials. But now we have them, so hopefully we can move forward as quickly as possible.
Do you guys have more, or do you have another question?
I think that it will be important. America is a very diverse country to, when we take a harder look at the trials, see where they're planning to test, like what these areas look like. Are they diverse? Are they how's the geography? And what are these products? I mean, certainly they shouldn't, whatever they're moving forward with should be comparable or better. And certainly we want to make sure that the reliability and the emergency services functioning is not going to jeopardize the health and well-being of the community or the schools.
Any other expectations on timing? I know we talked about it.
These are going to be multi-year trials, and so having data back in 14 months will be some of the data, but it won't be all of the data. So it's going to take longer than that.
And there's a piece. The FCC is in the midst of grading their complaints process, but here's the question: if these trials take place in a state that's deregulated, or where the state utility commission feels like it doesn't have jurisdiction to take complaints, members of Congress may be hearing from their constituents about, what the folks are feeling about what's going on with them in the trial. So, I mean, really sort of thinking through how are we going to get all of these strains of feedback.
That's a good point.
Let's go to another question. I want to go to did you have one? Or?
I have one. I'm already done. I have the AARP.
Oh,
is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to get some feedback. You've run out a number of public policy, public interest thoughts and things. But what about the whole issue of reclassification? And at this point, is reclassification dead, or would that be a solution to the supposed problem?
So we are talking about IP networks, and reclassification often comes up with IP networks and the net neutrality decision. Thoughts? Who wants to tackle that one first?
The answer is I don't see anything here that there are a number, and Cheryl mentioned this, there are a number of other tools they have. The court in the net neutrality decision, while it did strike down 2 provisions of the Open Internet Order, it upheld broad authority under Section 706 for the FCC to do really anything it wants within the scope of communications and without violating some specific provision of the Communications Act to promote advanced communications network, which means not only broadband, but also things that would include the sort of things that we're talking about with IP transition network. So that's one. But there are other things too. I mean, a lot of the public safety things we've been discussing today, the FCC can clearly regulate through using ancillary jurisdiction. And then finally, as I mentioned, they have authority under Section 251E to regulate any company that wants access to the numbering system. So, today we're not talking about pure VoIP like Skype. We're talking about something that is like VoIP, except it uses a traditional phone number. And that hook gives the FCC pretty broad authority to continue regulating. But I would add that the FCC is not the only regulator in town. The Federal Trade Commission has jurisdiction to enforce consumer protection laws. So billing practices and cramming and so on are already regulated by the Federal Trade Commission and could be as well after this transition, even if the FCC doesn't have to do anything. So reclassification isn't necessary. I also don't think it's politically viable. The simple reality is that the FCC has a lot on its plate. The National Broadband Plan I keep mentioning, they've done very little on. There's a lot to figure out here. And reclassification would end up being an enormous time suck for the agency. It's a very complicated process that would result in litigation. It would be even worse than what the FCC, in terms of the time that it took, it would take even more time Aaron Jankowski's pursuit of net neutrality regulations did. And that frankly cost the agency time that it could have spent on opening up spectrum or dealing with tower construction. So I just don't really think that that's either very likely or necessary, even apart from whether it's a good idea.
Well, let's briefly I want to get to one more, and then we'll.
Right now, we're in limbo. It's not an information service, it's not a communications or telecommunications service, and it needs to be classified for the states to understand. Right now, Iowa does regulate VoIP. Iowa took the very logical approach that telecommunications service is telecommunications service, and you should be able to have the same protections that you have because you're picking up a phone that is connected to a copper network that you do if it's connected to VoIP. And that's the concern, is that many states are unsure or just deregulating altogether. Many states have completely deregulated regardless of the lack of competition or competition. They've decided that the utility commissions will not collect complaint data. So if it's going bad, you may not even know it. You know, the basic protection, sort of the essence of universal service, are the carriers of last resorts. And 13 states have withdrawn their carrier of last resorts requirement. Now, no carrier has chosen to take away that service yet, but if they do, you know, that's going to be a disaster.
Your carrier of last resort is you call up, you get a phone. If you could conceivably, if there was no carrier of last resort, you could have a household that cannot get a phone because there's no legal obligation to provide you a phone anymore. That's what a carrier of last resort is.
Thanks.
If there are no other questions, we have reached our time limit, we can go to last thoughts from everyone. Berin, if you have one more thought, and if other folks.
Yeah, number one, I think the FCC has authority to do everything it needs to do without even using 706, so I don't think that's really where the issue is. 706 does grant the states broad power. Just to wrap up on competition economics, the central point I'm trying to impart is that everyone thinks about the Universal Service Fund as being the way that we subsidized communications in the past, and they forget that we also had a system of cross subsidies that nobody ever saw in their bottom line, but consumers in some areas were paying to subsidize consumers in other areas. And my point is, as soon as you have even one more competitor in the marketplace, that system breaks down. We cannot expect that system to work anymore, which is really to say that if we're going to have subsidies, they have to be explicit. That may mean taking things through the Universal Service Fund. We can have a debate about what that should look like, but implicit, hidden subsidies do not work anymore. And then finally, on competition, I don't think it magically brings down prices. I mean, part of my point is that competition is only going to bring down prices to something that kind of approximates costs. And in some areas, costs are just really high, and we have to deal with that reality. And if we want to subsidize service to those areas, that's one thing, but it has to be through an explicit mechanism. And then finally, on the idea that you need 10 providers, that's just not borne out by economic data. You can have 2 or 3 providers in an area that actually do bring you the benefits of competition. Again, understanding that it still may not be cheap enough, and you still may want to subsidize it. The real issue, if there really were a problem here, would be with interconnection. We haven't seen that as a problem in the internet. The antitrust laws already deal with that, and so can the FCC.
Last thoughts, anyone?
I
know we could go on forever.
No. I was just going to say, I think we go back to universal principles of universal service, network reliability, public safety, and consumer protection.
Both those are the ones the FCC highlighted. So, anyone else? I hope you guys will join me in thanking our panel for. I certainly thank you guys for your flexibility, one, with the timing, and 2, for giving us a lively discussion. Before you go, we are recording this, and so we do hope to be able to put it up on the Public Knowledge website, so you can tell your friends about it and share it with them soon. And thank you all for coming.